She's an absolute gem. She sings, dances, cooks, drives the car. Just been a joy to me.
At 99 years old, Dick Van Dyke remains one of the last living treasures of Hollywood's golden age. A man whose smile, wit, and timeless energy have carried him through nearly a century of entertainment. But in a recent candid conversation, the legendary star shocked fans by revealing something no one expected, a list of 6 actresses he secretly adored and, in his own playful words, would have loved to take dancing lessons with, privately. Of course, coming from Dick Van Dyke, it wasn't scandalous. It was charming, funny, and surprisingly heartfelt. Known for his wholesome humor and gentle spirit, Van Dyke spoke not from desire, but from admiration. He reminisced about the women who defined his generation of cinema, their elegance, their talent, and the way they carried themselves both on and off the screen. Each name he mentioned carried a story, a moment on set, a spark of chemistry, or a memory frozen in Hollywood history. For Van Dyke, these weren't just actresses. They were symbols of a time when love, laughter, and class ruled the screen. Now, as he reflects on his long and extraordinary life, he's finally sharing the names and the heartfelt reasons behind each one. So, who were the 6 women Dick Van Dyke admired most? And what made them unforgettable in his eyes? Let's begin with the first. The woman who redefined grace in Hollywood. When Dick Van Dyke spoke about the first woman on his list, his tone softened, almost reverent. He described her as the kind of woman who made the room quieter just by walking into it. He was, of course, talking about Audrey Hepburn, a name synonymous with grace, elegance, and kindness. Van Dyke never worked directly with Hepburn, but he often said he wished he had. "If I'd ever shared the screen with her," he once laughed, "I wouldn't have remembered my lines. I'd have just stood there smiling." To him, Audrey represented everything that Hollywood was supposed to be: beautiful, intelligent, yet deeply human. In interviews, Van Dyke recalled seeing her perform for the first time in Roman Holiday and being struck not just by her beauty, but by her humility. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Hepburn didn't chase attention. It found her naturally. "She never had to shout to be heard," he said. "She spoke softly, but the whole world listened." What fascinated Van Dyke most wasn't Audrey's star power, it was her heart. He admired her humanitarian work, her quiet strength during times of loss, and the way she treated everyone with the same warmth, from studio heads to stagehands. "She carried herself like a princess," Van Dyke said, "but she treated everyone like royalty." Behind his humor, there was sincerity. He often mentioned that Audrey's combination of beauty and compassion was rare in the business. Hollywood, he said, could harden people, but not her. Even after becoming an icon, she remained kind. "She reminded us all," Van Dyke once shared, "that you could be both glamorous and good." During the golden years of television and film, when Van Dyke's own career was soaring, he often compared the industry's changing values to the ones Hepburn embodied. While others chased fame, Audrey lived with purpose. While many actors sought the spotlight, she stepped away from it when her heart called her elsewhere. He joked that she was the kind of woman who could have broken his heart, but gently. "If Audrey ever told me no," he laughed, "I'd thank her for saying it so beautifully." As he entered his later years, Van Dyke spoke less about fame and more about character. Audrey's name always seemed to appear in those conversations, as though she symbolized the era he loved most. She represented decency, balance, and charm, the same qualities Van Dyke himself built his legacy on. "She didn't have to be perfect," he once said. "She just had to be herself, and that was enough for the whole world." For Dick Van Dyke, Audrey Hepburn wasn't just a star he admired. She was a reminder of what Hollywood once was, and what it could still be. A place where grace mattered, kindness counted, and beauty came from within. And while he admitted, with that trademark twinkle in his eye, that he would have loved to take her out to dinner and dance under the stars, he said it with pure affection, not fantasy. To him, Audrey Hepburn wasn't just the woman every man dreamed of. She was the woman who made men dream better. By the 1960s, Dick Van Dyke had become the ultimate symbol of American charm. His smile lit up the Dick Van Dyke Show, His graceful movements turned Mary Poppins into a masterpiece, and his humor seemed effortlessly pure. But behind the curtain of family-friendly television, Hollywood was a playground of temptation. Parties at Beverly Hills mansions, champagne flowing endlessly, and co-stars who blurred the lines between friendship and forbidden desire. Dick, then in his 30s, was surrounded by some of the most dazzling women in Hollywood's history, women whose allure could captivate any man. But for a man known for his clean-cut image, these attractions were dangerous secrets. In a later interview, Dick would half-jokingly confess that some of these women nearly ruined his concentration on set. One of the first names he mentioned was Mary Tyler Moore. His on-screen wife in The Dick Van Dyke Show. Mary was magnetic. Her quick wit and understated sensuality made her both funny and irresistible. "We had chemistry that scared me," Dick once said, recalling moments between takes when laughter lingered a little too long. Though nothing inappropriate ever happened, the tension between them was something neither could fully ignore. Then came Julie Andrews, his co-star in Mary Poppins. To audiences, she was the embodiment of innocence and grace. But Dick once admitted that Julie's poise made her the most dangerously attractive woman he had ever met. "You couldn't help but fall in love with her professionalism," he laughed years later. Their friendship was pure. But in the enchanted world of Mary Poppins, even fantasy had its temptations. But not all his desires were born from on-set relationships. Dick's admiration stretched far beyond his co-stars, to Hollywood legends who defined glamour itself. Among them was Sophia Loren, whose exotic beauty and confidence stunned an entire generation. Van Dyke, in one of his memoir interviews, confessed that seeing her on the big screen was almost too much for the human heart. Then there was Raquel Welch, a woman whose name alone evoked the wild, untamed side of the 1960s. She represented everything opposite of Dick's clean image, bold, sensual, and fearless. "She walked into a room and the air changed," he said. "I'd forget my lines just thinking about her." Another on his list was Anne Margaret, Elvis Presley's fiery co-star, whose energy both intimidated and excited him. "She had this power," Dick said. "A combination of innocence and danger, the kind that could make any man lose his mind." But Van Dyke's list wasn't just about physical attraction. It reflected the women who defined an era, each in her own way: strength, independence, beauty, and mystery. He admired Elizabeth Taylor, the epitome of old Hollywood royalty, and even admitted that if he'd ever been brave enough to flirt with her, he would have made a complete fool of himself. Behind his laughter and light-hearted confession lay a man who had seen Hollywood's seductive side and walked away humbled. Dick was no saint. He later admitted his battles with alcoholism nearly destroyed him, but even in those moments of weakness, he remained deeply respectful of the women he admired. "They made me better," he said. "They reminded me that temptation isn't about sin. It's about being human." As the years passed, these memories became stories, nostalgic, sometimes bittersweet. But each name he mentioned reflected a time when Hollywood shimmered like a dream, and every smile hid a secret. When asked if he regretted never pursuing any of them, Dick chuckled and said, "No, I think that's why I'm still alive." Those women were dangerous, in the best possible way. By the 1970s, Dick Van Dyke's life seemed picture-perfect from the outside. He was the smiling face of wholesome entertainment, a man who danced through life as easily as he did across stage floors. But behind that cheerful grin there was conflict. Hollywood's glamour had its shadows, and Dick's personal struggles were beginning to mirror the chaos he saw all around him. His fame brought him into the orbit of stars who lived dangerously and loved recklessly. Hollywood wasn't just a dream factory. It was a breeding ground for addiction, broken marriages, and emotional collapse. Dick had always been open about his admiration for beauty, but the constant exposure to temptation made staying grounded almost impossible. He began drinking more, at first to unwind after long shooting days, then to numb a loneliness that fame couldn't cure. "The bottle became my best friend," he once confessed. It was during these darker years that his relationship suffered most. His marriage was crumbling, his health was deteriorating, and even his creative spark began to fade. And yet, amidst this turmoil, the women he had once admired became a mirror for his own transformation. He would later reflect that women like Mary Tyler Moore, Julie Andrews, and Anne Margaret had something he envied: strength. While he struggled to hold himself together, they thrived in a world designed to tear women apart. Mary Tyler Moore, for instance, broke barriers by becoming one of the first women to lead her own television show. Dick once said, "Mary taught me more about resilience than anyone I ever knew." Julie Andrews, after losing her singing voice to a failed surgery, reinvented herself as a stage and film icon. "That's courage," Dick said. "To lose your greatest gift and still shine." Even his fascination with Elizabeth Taylor took on new meaning over time. He came to admire her not for her beauty, but for her compassion, especially her later life advocacy work and charity efforts. "She aged gracefully," he said, "because she grew into her heart." But not all memories brought comfort. Dick sometimes admitted that his obsession with perfection, both personally and professionally, left him emotionally drained. Hollywood demanded constant charm, eternal youth, and flawless smiles. "You start believing you have to be happy all the time," he explained. "And when you're not, you feel like a fraud." His struggle with alcoholism reached its breaking point in the early 1980s. One night, after blacking out at home, he finally realized he was losing everything that truly mattered. "I was killing myself one drink at a time," he said. It was then that he sought help, not from fame or friends, but from his inner strength. "I decided I wanted to live again." Sobriety gave him clarity and humility. Looking back on his career, he no longer romanticized Hollywood's beauty or excess. Instead, he saw it for what it was: a glittering illusion built on fragile human souls. He often said that the true heroes of that era weren't the men who played the tough guys, but the women who survived its cruelty. In later interviews, when asked about the list of actresses he once desired, Dick smiled wistfully. "They were angels in disguise," he said. "Each one taught me something about love, loss, or forgiveness. I was a fool for wanting them, but an even bigger fool for thinking fame could fill the same space." By the time he found peace in his later years, Dick Van Dyke had turned his pain into wisdom. The laughter remained, but it came from a deeper, calmer place. "You can chase beauty, or you can chase joy," he said. "Only one of them stays with you when the lights go out." In a town obsessed with youth and desire, Dick learned that the greatest love story wasn't about who you wanted. It was about learning to forgive yourself for the choices you made along the way. As Dick Van Dyke approached his 90s and beyond, his reflections on fame, love, and legacy took on a deeply human tone. The man once known for his effortless charm and boundless energy had become a living symbol of grace, not because of the roles he played, but because of the humility with which he aged. When interviewers asked him about the 6 actresses he wanted to sleep with, he no longer blushed or deflected the question. Instead, he laughed, that warm, familiar laugh that had filled living rooms for generations, and said, "I was young, foolish, and completely overwhelmed by beauty. But what I really wanted was connection, not conquest." In those later years, Dick wasn't shy about speaking candidly. He admitted that Hollywood had both blessed and broken him. The glamour was intoxicating, but it came with an invisible price. "You spend your life pretending to be everyone else," he said, "and one day you wake up wondering who you really are." Yet, unlike many of his contemporaries, Dick managed to hold on to his sense of wonder. He continued to sing, dance, and make people laugh well into his 90s. His performances became less about precision and more about presence. Even when his body ached and his voice cracked, his spirit remained unshaken. "Age doesn't stop you from being alive," he said. "Giving up does." He married again in 2012 to makeup artist Arlene Silver, who was decades younger but shared his joy for life. The media called it unusual, but Dick didn't care. "Love doesn't keep time," he said. "It just keeps growing." Their relationship became one of the sweetest chapters in his long story, a reminder that love can be rediscovered, even after loss and heartbreak. As he looked back on his relationships with Hollywood's most iconic women, Dick spoke with gratitude rather than regret. He called Julie Andrews a beam of sunlight, Mary Tyler Moore a brilliant partner, and Elizabeth Taylor, a woman who carried her pain like a crown. He even expressed admiration for actresses he had never worked with but had admired from afar. Audrey Hepburn, Sophia Loren, and Shirley MacLaine, not for their allure, but for their authenticity. In private moments, Dick often mused about how strange it was that people still saw him as that smiling man from Mary Poppins and the Dick Van Dyke Show. They see the laughter, he said, but not the lessons behind it. He had lost friends, battled addiction, and wrestled with loneliness, but he never lost faith, in himself or in the power of joy. When asked what he wanted his legacy to be, he simply replied, "That I made people feel good for a little while." It was that simple. Fame, awards, and headlines never defined him. Laughter did. Even at 99, he still got up to dance, sing, and make his wife laugh every morning. Movement is life, he often said, and laughter is the best kind of movement. In one of his final in-depth interviews, Dick shared a sentiment that encapsulated everything he had come to understand about love and longing. "I once thought beauty was something you chased. But it turns out, beauty is what's left when everything else fades. Kindness, joy, and the way you make others feel." The same man who once daydreamed about the glamorous actresses of Hollywood's golden age had found peace not in fantasy, but in forgiveness, for himself, for the industry, and for the wild ride it had given him. Now, as fans look back at Dick Van Dyke's extraordinary journey, one thing stands out: he never stopped dancing. Through heartbreak and healing, through fame and fading spotlight, he remained a man who believed that laughter could outlive sorrow. And perhaps that's the real secret he never meant to hide. That the heart, even after a century of beating through love, loss, and laughter, still finds a reason to dance.